Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The smell hit me the second I stepped out of my unmarked Crown Vic at the storage facility on Milwaukee's industrial side. August heat made everything worse, turning the air thick and heavy like breathing through wet cloth. I'd been a detective for 15 years, seen plenty of decomposition cases, but this was different somehow. The manager who'd called us, Frank something or other with tobacco-stained teeth and a permanent squint, was already waiting by the office door, sweating through his shirt despite the early afternoon breeze. He kept wiping his palms on his jeans and wouldn't make eye contact for more than a second at a time. My partner had called in sick that morning with food poisoning from bad sushi, leaving me to handle what dispatch described as complaints about an odor at this place wedged between an abandoned textile factory and a scrapyard where nobody asked questions. Frank led me through rows of orange metal doors, each one identical except for the fading numbers painted in white. Unit 47B sat at the end of a corridor, far from the main entrance where most renters kept their stuff. He told me the renter was some guy named Christopher Vaughn, who'd been paying cash 3 months in advance for the past 8 months, never missed a payment, never caused trouble until about 3 weeks ago when other renters started complaining. The smell got stronger with each step we took toward that unit, and I noticed Frank had stopped about 30 feet away, fumbling with his master keys while trying not to breathe through his nose. Dead pigeons lined the concrete near the unit's door, and flies buzzed in thick clouds despite the industrial-strength pest control the facility supposedly used monthly. When Frank finally got the padlock off, his hands trembling so bad he dropped the keys twice, I told him to step back and call for backup. The metal door rolled up with a grinding screech that echoed through the corridor, and what I saw inside made me understand why those pigeons had died. The unit was bigger than expected, maybe 10 by 20 feet, lined wall to wall with chest freezers. 7 of them, all humming with electricity, all duct-taped shut around the edges like someone really didn't want them opened accidentally. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and rotten and chemical all at once, like meat left in formaldehyde under the sun. Each freezer had a label maker strip across the front with dates going back months, some kind of coding system I couldn't immediately understand. Between the freezers were boxes of medical supplies, the kind you'd see in a hospital storage room. Surgical gloves, scalpels still in sterile packaging, bone saws, and bottles of chemicals with names I'd need a medical degree to pronounce. I pulled out my phone to call it in, but the signal was weak in the metal building, so I had to step outside. While I waited for the crime scene unit and additional officers, I asked Frank about Christopher Vaughn. He pulled out a rental agreement from a manila folder he'd been clutching, showing me a photocopy of a driver's license. The photo showed a thin man, maybe 35, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed to stare through the camera rather than at it. Frank mentioned Vaughn always came at odd hours, usually after midnight or before dawn, always alone, always carrying black garbage bags that looked heavy. The other renters had started complaining about the smell 3 weeks ago, but Frank admitted he'd noticed something weird months earlier when he'd seen Vaughn wheeling in what looked like restaurant equipment on a dolly at 3 a.m. The first unit arrived within 15 minutes. 2 patrol officers who immediately called for hazmat when they caught the smell. We established a perimeter while waiting for the crime scene techs, and I started running Vaughn's name through the system on my laptop in the car. What came back made my chest tighten. Christopher Eugene Vaughn, expelled from Northwestern's medical school 6 years ago for stealing cadavers from the anatomy lab. He'd been caught performing unauthorized procedures on bodies meant for student education, keeping detailed notes about decomposition rates and preservation methods. The university had pressed charges, but they were dropped when Vaughn agreed to psychiatric treatment. His last known address was his mother's house in Kenosha, but she'd reported him missing 2 years ago, said he'd become obsessed with something he called understanding the transition, and stopped taking his medication. By the time the crime scene unit arrived in full hazmat gear, We'd evacuated the entire facility and set up a command post in the parking lot. The lead tech, a woman named Diane, who'd worked scenes with me before, went in first with a camera while I watched the feed on a monitor they'd set up. When she cut through the duct tape on the first freezer and lifted the lid, even through the grainy video feed, I could see her whole body recoil. Inside, wrapped in clear plastic like cuts of meat at a butcher shop, were human remains in various stages of dismemberment. Arms separated at the joints, organs in sealed bags with labels indicating weights and dates, everything arranged with a precision that made it clear this wasn't random violence. Diane's voice crackled through the radio, professional but strained, confirming what we could all see. We were dealing with multiple victims. Over the next 4 hours, the team documented everything while I coordinated with headquarters. Each freezer told its own horrible story. The second one contained what appeared to be complete skeletons, cleaned and numbered with tiny metal tags like museum specimens. The third had organs floating in jars of preservation fluid, each container meticulously labeled with extraction dates, body weights, and what looked like medical observations written in cramped handwriting. Diane found notebooks stacked between the freezers, hundreds of pages of detailed notes about decomposition rates, tissue preservation, and crude autopsy techniques. Vaughn had been teaching himself, using stolen bodies as practice. The medical examiner who arrived later identified at least 12 distinct individuals based on preliminary examination, though she warned the actual number could be higher. Most appeared to be bodies stolen from morgues and funeral homes across 3 states, matching reports of missing corpses that had been filed over the past 8 months. The breakthrough came when one of the techs found a laptop hidden behind the 7th freezer, still logged into Vaughn's email account. He'd been corresponding with black market dealers, people who sold medical specimens to underground collectors and unlicensed research facilities. But the emails showed he'd never actually sold anything. Instead, he kept writing about perfecting his technique, about understanding death in a way medical school never taught. One email to a potential buyer, dated just 5 days ago, said he was close to something important, that he'd discovered patterns in decomposition that nobody else had documented. The laptop also contained hundreds of photos, each showing different stages of his work, faces blurred out, but everything else in sharp, clinical detail. There were spreadsheets tracking everything from ambient temperature to humidity levels in the storage unit, treating the whole thing like some twisted scientific experiment. We tracked Vaughn down through his credit card. Despite paying for the storage unit in cash, he'd been stupid enough to use his Visa at a motel about 40 miles north, near the state line. The place was one of those pay-by-the-week dumps where nobody asked questions, and the carpets hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. Local police surrounded room 23 just after sunset, and I was there when they breached the door. Vaughn didn't resist. He was sitting at a desk made of particle board, writing in another notebook surrounded by medical textbooks and printed articles about decomposition. He looked nothing like his driver's license photo anymore. His hair had grown past his shoulders, greasy and tangled, and he'd lost so much weight his clothes hung off him like they belonged to someone else. His fingernails were long and dirty, with what looked like dried blood underneath them. When I read him his rights, he just nodded and asked if we'd found his work, said it was important that someone preserved his research. During the interrogation, Vaughn was disturbingly calm, speaking about the bodies like a professor discussing lab specimens. He admitted to everything but seemed genuinely confused why we were treating it as a crime. He explained how he'd gotten the bodies, bribing night shift workers at funeral homes, breaking into morgues using stolen key cards, sometimes taking bodies that were meant for cremation so they wouldn't be missed immediately. He'd been practicing autopsies, teaching himself what medical school had denied him, documenting everything because he believed he was contributing to science. When I asked him about the families of these people, about the violation of human dignity, he tilted his head like I was speaking a foreign language. He said the dead didn't care, that they were just organic matter reorganizing itself, and that his work would help future medical students understand decomposition better than any textbook. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and I testified on the second day. Vaughn's lawyer tried for an insanity plea, bringing in psychiatrists who diagnosed him with severe delusional disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. But the jury saw through it. The meticulous planning, the careful selection of victims who wouldn't be immediately missed, the elaborate concealment methods, it all pointed to someone who knew exactly what they were doing was wrong. He got life without parole, though he never stopped insisting he was a researcher, not a criminal. The storage facility was demolished 6 months later after the owner couldn't rent a single unit. Frank quit the day we found everything and moved to Florida, said he couldn't stop smelling that stench even after the place was cleaned. The families of the identified bodies finally got closure, could finally have proper burials, though some remains were too damaged to ever be returned. I retired 2 years after the Vaughn case, earlier than I'd planned. Not because of fear or trauma, but because something fundamental had shifted in how I saw the job. In 15 years, I'd investigated murders driven by rage, greed, jealousy, emotions I could at least understand even if I condemned them. But Vaughn's complete detachment, his ability to see human bodies as nothing more than study materials, left me with questions I couldn't answer. Sometimes I still get calls from journalists wanting to write about the case, especially around the anniversary. I always decline. What haunts me isn't the horror of what we found in that storage unit, but Vaughn's genuine belief that he was doing something valuable. The last thing he said to me, as they led him away in shackles, was that someone would continue his work someday. That knowledge couldn't be suppressed forever. I hope he's wrong, but sometimes late at night, I wonder if there's someone else out there, in another storage unit or basement, carrying on where he left off. I'm Detective Ellen Carter, and I've been with the police force in a small Colorado town for about 12 years now. It was a Monday morning in early September 2022 when everything changed for me. I'd just gotten back from a week-long vacation with my husband and our 2 kids, feeling refreshed and ready to dive back into what I thought would be another routine week of petty thefts and noise complaints. Our town had always been one of those places where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets until dark. I was sitting at my desk, catching up on paperwork and sipping the terrible coffee from the break room machine, when dispatch called about a welfare check on Cedar Lane. Mrs. Thompson hadn't shown up for her weekly book club, and her friends were worried because she never missed a meeting, not even when she had pneumonia 2 winters ago. Cedar Lane was one of those picture-perfect suburban streets with matching mailboxes and well-maintained lawns that looked like they belonged in a real estate magazine. I drove there alone since my partner was testifying in court that day, figuring it would be a quick check. Probably find Mrs. Thompson had fallen asleep watching TV, or maybe taken an unexpected trip to visit her daughter in Denver. The Thompson house was a modest 2-story with pale yellow siding and a wraparound porch decorated with hanging baskets of petunias that were starting to wilt in the late summer heat. When I knocked and got no answer, I noticed the front door was actually slightly ajar. Just a crack, like someone had tried to close it but the latch hadn't caught properly. The mail from Saturday was still sticking out of the mailbox, and there was a package from Amazon sitting on the porch that looked like it had been there for at least a couple of days based on the water stains from the sprinkler system. I pushed the door open with my shoulder, announcing myself loudly as I stepped inside. The house smelled weird, not like death. I knew that smell too well from my years on the force, but something chemical mixed with the lingering aroma of cooked food. The living room looked completely normal. TV remote on the coffee table next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, and reading glasses. But when I walked through to the dining room, that's when I saw her. Mrs. Thompson was sitting perfectly upright in her chair at the head of the table, facing a full plate of what looked like roast chicken, with mashed potatoes and green beans. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes were closed like she'd just dozed off during dinner. The food hadn't been touched. The butter pat on the potatoes hadn't even melted, and there was still steam condensation on the inside of the water glass. which told me this meal had been served recently, maybe within the last day or two. I checked for a pulse, even though her skin had that waxy gray tint that meant she'd been gone for at least 24 hours. The positioning was what bothered me most. Nobody dies naturally sitting that perfectly straight, with their hands folded like they're posing for a family portrait. I called it in immediately, requesting backup and the coroner, then started examining the scene more carefully without touching anything. The kitchen showed signs of normal meal preparation: dirty pots in the sink, vegetable peelings in the trash, a cookbook still open to a recipe for herb-roasted chicken. But there was also a clipboard on the counter with what looked like a work order from Riverside Utilities, dated 3 days prior, signed by someone named Jason Brennan, with a note about checking the gas lines for the neighborhood modernization project. I photographed everything with my phone while waiting for the crime scene unit, and that's when I noticed something else strange. There was a second-place setting at the table, directly across from Mrs. Thompson, but that plate was completely clean, like someone had eaten their entire meal and even wiped the plate with bread. While the forensics team processed the Thompson house, I decided to canvass the neighborhood to see if anyone had noticed this utility worker or anything unusual over the past few days. The first neighbor I talked to was Mr. Gallagher, a retired postal worker who lived directly across the street and was known for sitting on his porch most afternoons. He mentioned seeing a white van with Riverside Utilities painted on the side, parked in front of several houses on the street earlier in the week. But he hadn't thought much of it since there had been notices about infrastructure updates posted on everyone's doors the previous month. He described the worker as a clean-cut guy, maybe mid-30s, wearing the typical blue uniform and carrying a toolbox and clipboard. What stuck with Mr. Gallagher was how friendly the guy was, stopping to chat with everyone, asking about their families, even helped Mrs. Ningian carry her groceries in when he saw her struggling with the bags. That's when Mrs. Gallagher mentioned something that made my chest tighten with dread. She said their next-door neighbors, the Andersons, hadn't been seen since Saturday, and their newspaper was piling up on the driveway. The Andersons were a couple in their 60s who kept to themselves, but were reliable about maintaining their property. Their garage door was still open with both cars inside, which was completely out of character for them. I radioed for additional units immediately and headed to the Anderson house with 2 officers who had just arrived as backup. The front door was locked, but when we went around back, we found the sliding glass door to the kitchen unlocked. The smell hit us immediately, that same chemical odor mixed with food, but stronger this time. In the dining room, we found Mr. and Mrs. Anderson seated at opposite ends of their table, both in that same unnaturally upright position, both with untouched plates of food in front of them. Looked like spaghetti with meat sauce, salad on the side, glasses of red wine that had never been sipped. The Andersons had the same clipboard on their kitchen counter, same Riverside Utilities letterhead, same signature from Jason Brennan, dated the day before Mrs. Thompson's visit. But this time I found something else. A business card tucked under a magnet on their refrigerator with the Riverside Utilities logo and a phone number. When I called it from my cell, I got a disconnected number message. The real Riverside Utilities, when we contacted them, had no record of any Jason Brennan, no scheduled maintenance on Cedar Lane, and their official vans were accounted for in their fleet. They also confirmed their workers wore orange uniforms, not blue, and they never did door-to-door visits without sending official letters at least 2 weeks in advance. The forensics photographer was documenting everything when one of the officers found something in the Andersons' trash, an empty box of fancy chocolates with a thank you note that read, "For being such wonderful neighbors, Jason from Riverside Utilities." By this point, we had the entire street blocked off and were going door to door. Most residents were at work, but the retirees and stay-at-home parents were all accounted for and safe, though shaken when we explained what was happening. Then we got to the Washburn house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Joyce Washburn was a widow in her 70s who lived alone and was known for her incredible garden and homemade jam that she gave out every Christmas. Her car was in the driveway. Her sprinklers were running on schedule, but she wasn't answering the door. The neighbor had a spare key. They checked on each other regularly. And when we entered, I already knew what we'd find. There she was, seated at her small kitchen table with a bowl of soup and a sandwich in front of her, untouched, hands folded, that same terrible upright posture. The clipboard was there too, but this time there was also a plate of cookies on the counter with a handwritten note. "Joyce, thank you for the lovely chat and lemonade. Enjoy these as a small token of appreciation. JB." The medical examiner arrived within the hour and did preliminary tests on Mrs. Thompson while we waited. He found no obvious signs of violence or struggle, but noted petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes and a slight blue tinge around her lips that suggested poisoning. The way he explained it to me, certain toxins could cause respiratory paralysis while keeping the victim conscious and aware for several minutes, long enough for someone to position them however they wanted. The thought of these poor people being unable to move or call for help while this monster arranged them like dolls at their own dinner tables made me physically sick. I had to step outside for a minute to compose myself, and that's when I saw something that everyone else had missed. Fresh tire tracks in the mud beside Joyce Washburn's driveway, where her sprinklers had overwatered the edge of the lawn. The tracks were distinctive. Heavy vehicle, probably a van, with what looked like a nail or screw embedded in the rear left tire that left a small puncture mark every rotation. We immediately put out a bolo for any white van with Riverside Utilities markings and that specific tire damage. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night interviewing neighbors, reviewing security footage from the few houses that had cameras, and trying to piece together this Jason Brennan's movements. The security footage we did get showed him clearly. Average height, brown hair, clean-shaven, probably around 35, wearing that blue uniform and always carrying the same black toolbox and clipboard. He had this way of walking with a slight bounce in his step, almost cheerful, and in one video you could see him whistling while he walked up to the Andersons' door. What really got to me was how normal he looked, how he smiled and waved at a kid riding by on a bicycle, how he stopped to pet someone's dog. He spent between 30 and 45 minutes in each house, and in every case, he was the last person seen entering before the victims were found dead. The breakthrough came around 3 a.m. when an officer found the van abandoned in a grocery store parking lot about 15 miles away. It had been set on fire, but the rain from that evening had put it out before it was completely destroyed. The VIN number had been filed off, but our forensics team found partial prints on a water bottle in the cab and DNA on a cigarette butt. The toolbox was still in the back, containing vials of what turned out to be succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in hospitals that's incredibly hard to get without medical credentials, mixed with a slow-acting poison that would kill within hours. There were also stacks of fake business cards, several blue uniforms, and most disturbing of all, a notebook with addresses and details about dozens of elderly residents across 3 states, with Cedar Lane being just one of many streets marked with red check marks. Mrs. Thompson, the Andersons, and Joyce Washburn all had stars next to their names with notes like "Lives Alone," "Trusting," and "Offers Refreshments." We ran the prints and DNA through every database we had access to, and got a hit 6 hours later. The man calling himself Jason Brennan was actually Gregory Hoffman, a former hospice nurse who'd lost his license 5 years earlier for stealing medications, and who had a history of financial fraud targeting elderly patients. He'd been moving across the Midwest, hitting small towns where people still trusted strangers in uniforms, where elderly folks living alone would open their doors to a friendly utility worker, warning about gas leaks or offering free safety inspections. We caught him 2 days later at a motel in Nebraska, preparing to hit another neighborhood. He'd already distributed flyers and made initial contact with several potential victims. When we arrested him, he was calm, almost proud, and the only thing he said was that he'd been helping them avoid the indignity of dying alone in nursing homes. He's now serving 3 life sentences, but I know there are more victims out there we haven't found yet. I still drive by Cedar Lane sometimes, and even though new families have moved into those houses, I can't forget how I found those people, posed at their tables like some sick art installation, their last meals growing cold in front of them. The body cam footage was supposed to be routine review, just another Monday morning task at the Phoenix precinct where I'd been working as a detective. At 32, with 8 years in uniform behind me and 6 months in my new position, I thought I'd seen most of what this job had to offer. My desk was buried under case files from a string of burglaries that had been plaguing the wealthy neighborhoods on the north side. Empty coffee cups formed a small fortress around my keyboard, evidence of too many late nights trying to find patterns that weren't there. That particular morning in January 2023, the station was nearly deserted. Just me, the overnight dispatcher finishing up paperwork, and the distant echo of a vacuum cleaner somewhere down the hall. I'd come in early specifically to review the weekend's crime scene footage, hoping fresh eyes might catch something we'd all missed. What I found instead would make me question everything I thought I knew about the people I worked with. Detective Brian Caldwell's footage from the Whitmore Mansion burglary started like any other crime scene video. Brian had been my mentor when I first made detective, a 15-year veteran who knew every shortcut in the city, and always kept a box of fresh donuts in the break room on Fridays. But watching him move through that ransacked study, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. He'd arrived after the first responders had already done their initial sweep, walking past the obvious signs of disturbance: overturned drawers, scattered papers, a broken lamp. Instead of methodically examining the chaos like we'd been trained, Brian went straight to a bookshelf that looked untouched. Without hesitation, he pulled out a specific leather-bound atlas from the third shelf, revealing a wall safe that nobody else had noticed. The way his hand moved directly to that exact book, no searching, no feeling around. It was like watching someone retrieve something from their own home. I rewound the footage and watched again, my coffee growing cold as an uncomfortable weight settled in my stomach. I started pulling up Brian's body cam footage from other recent cases, telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he just had incredible instincts developed over his years on the force. The Riverside jewelry store hit from 2 weeks earlier loaded on my screen first. Again, Brian had arrived after the initial response team, and again, he'd found something everyone else missed: a dropped cufflink wedged behind a display case that later proved crucial for identifying the suspect. The footage showed him walking directly to that specific case, crouching down at the exact angle needed to spot the evidence. No systematic searching, no grid pattern like we were taught at the academy. Then I watched his footage from the Hammond residence break-in. This time, he'd discovered a partial fingerprint on the inside of a window frame that the crime scene techs had somehow overlooked. The pattern was becoming undeniable, each video adding another piece to a picture I didn't want to see forming. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard as I considered what to do next. Brian wasn't just my colleague. He'd been the one who showed me how to properly document evidence, who'd covered for me when I'd made a rookie mistake my first week as detective. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. I pulled up our case closure rates from the past year, cross-referencing them with Brian's involvement. The numbers made my throat go dry. Every case where Brian had found these miraculous pieces of evidence had been closed within days, usually with suspects who confessed almost immediately or took plea deals. Meanwhile, the cases he wasn't assigned to dragged on for weeks or months. I grabbed my personal notebook, the one I kept locked in my desk drawer, and started documenting everything, writing down timestamps and case numbers in my cramped handwriting. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows across my desk as I worked. The next step required accessing files above my clearance level, but I knew the records clerk, Donna, always came in early on Mondays to catch up on filing. She owed me a favor from when I'd covered for her during her daughter's emergency surgery last fall. I found her in the basement archives, surrounded by towers of manila folders and the musty smell of old paper. When I asked to see the evidence logs for Brian's cases, she raised an eyebrow but pulled them without questions. What I discovered made my pulse race. In every single case where Brian had found crucial evidence, he'd been the last person to access the evidence room the night before the discovery. The login records showed him entering after midnight, staying for 30 to 45 minutes, always when the security desk was staffed by Officer Ramirez, who was notorious for sleeping through his shifts. The pieces were falling into place in the worst possible way. I spent the rest of that morning digging deeper, and what I found turned my unease into genuine fear. Brian's bank records, which I accessed through a contact at Financial Crimes who didn't ask too many questions, showed deposits that didn't match his salary. $5,000 here, $8,000 there, always made within a week of his miraculous evidence discoveries. The deposits came from different LLCs with generic names like Consulting Solutions Group and Professional Services, Inc. A quick search revealed these companies were registered to a private investigation firm run by Anthony Reeves, a former cop who'd left the force under suspicious circumstances 5 years ago. Reeves had a reputation for getting results for his high-paying clients, the kind of people who wanted their stolen property recovered, or needed leverage in messy divorces. My stomach churned as I realized Brian wasn't just finding evidence, he was planting it, selling case information to criminals and PIs who needed to stay ahead of our investigations. Around noon, I heard Brian's distinctive laugh echoing from the break room, and my whole body tensed. He was chatting with other detectives about the upcoming Super Bowl, completely at ease, while I sat at my desk with enough evidence to destroy his career. But I needed more than suspicious patterns and financial records. I needed proof of him actually planting evidence or meeting with Reeves. I decided to tail him that evening, waiting in my beat-up Toyota Camry across from the precinct parking garage. At 6 p.m., Brian walked out like any other day, whistling some old rock song, his badge still clipped to his belt. He drove his silver Ford Explorer through downtown, making several unnecessary turns that told me he was checking for tails. My palms were slick on the steering wheel as I stayed 3 cars back, using every surveillance technique I'd learned. He finally pulled into a parking structure attached to the Marriott on Central Avenue. I parked 2 levels up and took the stairs down, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Through the concrete pillars, I watched Brian meet with a man in an expensive suit, Anthony Reeves, looking exactly like his old department photo but with grayer hair and a gold watch that caught the garage's harsh lighting. They stood between 2 SUVs and I could see Brian hand over what looked like a flash drive. I managed to get my phone out and record them, though my fingers trembled so badly I nearly dropped it twice. Their conversation was too quiet to hear clearly, but I caught fragments. Tomorrow's raid, evidence room at 2 a.m., and something about making sure the Morrison kid takes the fall. Reeves handed Brian an envelope that was thick enough to be cash, and they shook hands like old friends closing a business deal. After Reeves drove away, Brian stayed in the garage for another 10 minutes, making a phone call while pacing between the yellow parking lines. I stayed hidden behind a concrete support beam, barely breathing, recording everything until he finally left. That night I couldn't sleep. Every car that passed my apartment made me jump, wondering if Brian had somehow figured out I was onto him. I sat at my kitchen table with all my evidence spread out, printed screenshots, bank records, my handwritten notes, and my phone with the garage video. The smart move would be to go straight to internal affairs, but I knew Brian had friends everywhere, people who'd worked with him for over a decade who'd never believe he was dirty. I needed something undeniable, something that would force them to act immediately. Then I remembered tomorrow's raid that Brian had mentioned. I checked our department schedule on my laptop and found it, a dawn raid on a suspected drug house on Oak Street, with Brian leading the team. If he was planning to plant evidence at 2 a.m., I had to catch him in the act. I set my alarm for 1:30 a.m., placed my service weapon on the nightstand, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours. The evidence room at 2 a.m. was supposed to be empty except for the security guard, but when I arrived at the precinct, I parked a block away and entered through the side entrance using my key card. The hallways were dim, lit only by emergency lighting that made everything look gray and distorted. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the empty corridors as I made my way to the basement where we kept evidence. Sure enough, there was Brian's Explorer in the back lot, and Officer Ramirez was predictably asleep at the security desk, his head tilted back and soft snores filling the silence. I crept past him and down the stairs, using my phone's camera to record everything. The evidence room door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see Brian with a duffel bag, carefully placing bags of what looked like cocaine into evidence boxes labeled for tomorrow's raid. He was wearing latex gloves and had disabled the security camera. The red recording light was off. My throat felt like sandpaper as I watched him work methodically, even taking photos of the planted drugs to ensure they'd be discovered in the right locations. I knew I had enough evidence now, but I needed to act fast before Brian finished and destroyed any trace of what he'd done. With shaking fingers, I sent the video directly to Captain Rebecca Walsh's personal email. She was the only person in leadership I trusted completely, having worked with her when she was in internal affairs. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I live-streamed the rest to a private cloud account, making sure everything was backed up in real time. Brian must have heard something because he suddenly stopped and turned toward the door. For a terrifying moment, our eyes met through the crack, and I saw his expression shift from surprise to something cold and calculating. He dropped the evidence bag and reached for his service weapon, but I was already moving, sprinting down the hallway while shouting for Ramirez to wake up. Brian burst out of the evidence room behind me, and I heard him yelling that I was stealing evidence, trying to flip the narrative. But Ramirez had seen Brian's bag full of drugs, had seen him coming out of a room he shouldn't have been in, and most importantly, Captain Walsh was already calling for backup. Within 20 minutes, the precinct was swarming with internal affairs officers and FBI agents. Turns out, Brian had been on their radar for months, but they hadn't been able to prove anything concrete. My videos and documentation were the missing pieces they needed. Brian tried to maintain his innocence at first, claiming I'd set him up, but when they found 3 more burner phones in his car and a detailed ledger of his transactions hidden in his garage, he finally went quiet. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of 4 other officers across different precincts, all working with Reeves to manipulate cases for profit. 17 cases had to be reopened, including 3 where innocent people had been convicted based on planted evidence. Brian got 15 years in federal prison, Reeves got 20, and I got a commendation that felt hollow considering how many lives had been destroyed. I still work at the precinct, but now I review body cam footage with a different kind of attention, knowing that sometimes the real criminals are the ones wearing badges. The Morrison kid, the one Brian was going to frame, he was a 19-year-old college student who'd never had so much as a parking ticket. That's what haunts me most. Not what Brian did, but what almost happened if I hadn't been watching that footage on a quiet Monday morning. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio at 9:47 p.m., and right away, something about it made me grip the steering wheel tighter. 6 months patrolling the suburbs outside Portland, and you develop this instinct for which calls are going to stick with you. A woman named Margaret Hobbs, 67 years old, had just whispered into her phone that someone was inside her house at 4782 Willow Court. The dispatcher told me she'd gone silent mid-sentence, just cut off like someone had yanked the words right out of her throat. The line stayed open, though. 40 seconds of dead air, except for what sounded like a television playing some game show. Audience laughter echoing through an empty room. Margaret lived alone since her husband died 2 years back, one of those widows who kept to themselves but always waved when you drove past. October nights in Oregon get cold fast, and I remember cranking the heat as I turned onto her street, thinking about how scared she must be, hiding somewhere in that house. The cul-de-sac looked wrong before I even reached her driveway. Every house had their typical porch lights on, those soft amber glows that make suburbia feel like a cocoon. But Margaret's place blazed like a beacon. Every single window lit up bright white, even the basement and attic windows that nobody ever uses. The house itself was one of those split levels from the 70s, painted this hideous mustard yellow that had faded to something between beige and decay. Her front door hung open about 6 inches, swaying slightly in the wind like it was breathing. I radioed for backup, but dispatch said 20 minutes minimum. A pileup on Highway 26 had everyone tied up. The rules say wait for backup on a potential home invasion, but the rules also say protect and serve, and Margaret Hobbs needed protecting right now. From my cruiser, I could hear that television still going, some host asking about presidents and capitals, and underneath it this rhythmic dripping sound steady as a metronome. I stepped out of the cruiser with my flashlight in one hand, keeping the other near my holster, and announced myself from the driveway. "Police, Margaret Hobbs, this is Officer Price responding to your call." My voice bounced off the empty street and came back to me like an echo in a cave. The neighbors' houses stayed dark and quiet, no curious faces in windows, no one stepping out to see what the commotion was about. That should have been my first real warning. Willow Court was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where a police car would normally draw at least 3 concerned neighbors in bathrobes. But that night, it felt like the entire street was holding its breath. I approached the front door slowly, noting the door frame showed no signs of damage, no splintered wood or jimmy marks. The door had been opened with a key, or it hadn't been locked at all. Through the gap, I could see into the living room where the TV cast shifting blue light across beige carpet and floral wallpaper that probably hadn't been changed since the house was built. The smell hit me as soon as I pushed the door wider. Pot roast, still cooking, mixed with something else I couldn't place, something chemical and sharp like cleaning supplies, but wrong somehow. "Margaret Hobbs, police, I'm coming inside to check on your welfare." I stepped into the house and nearly jumped out of my skin when the door suddenly slammed shut behind me. Just the wind, I told myself, though I knew damn well the air had been still as death outside. The living room looked lived in but neat. One of those spaces old people keep frozen in time. Doilies on every surface, photos of grandkids in heavy frames, a collection of ceramic angels on the mantel. The TV was playing Jeopardy! Alex Trebek reading questions to an empty room. On the coffee table sat a TV guide open to that day's listings, a pair of reading glasses folded on top, and a cup of tea still steaming, the bag's string draped over the rim like it had just been made. I moved through the living room toward the kitchen, where that dripping sound grew louder. The dining room table stopped me cold. 3 plates set out, but only one had food. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, all half-eaten. The fork still stuck upright in the meat like someone had been interrupted mid-bite. The other 2 plates were clean, untouched, but the silverware was arranged differently at each setting. At the first empty plate, the knife and fork formed an X. At the second, they lay parallel, perfectly aligned. Steam still rose from the food, and when I touched the edge of the plate with the back of my hand, it was warm enough to make me pull away. The phone hung off its cradle on the wall, receiver dangling by its curly cord, swaying slightly, even though there was no breeze in the house. I picked it up and heard the dial tone, then noticed something that made my chest tighten. The phone cord had been cut clean through about 3 feet from the handset, yet somehow it still had a dial tone. The kitchen faucet was the source of that dripping, each drop hitting the steel sink with a metallic pink that seemed too loud in the silence. I turned it off, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps directly above me, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. "Police, come downstairs with your hands visible." The footsteps stopped immediately. I drew my weapon and moved toward the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming that something was fundamentally wrong here. The stairs creaked under my weight, that old house sound that usually feels homey but now felt like an announcement of my position. Halfway up, I noticed the family photos lining the wall, Margaret and her late husband through the decades, their kids, grandkids. But in every single photo, someone had scratched out Margaret's face with something sharp, leaving just jagged holes in the glass where her eyes should have been. Fresh glass shards crunched under my boots, meaning this had been done recently, maybe even while I was downstairs. The upstairs hallway stretched longer than it should have for a house this size, 4 doors on each side, all closed except for one at the far end. That room glowed with the same harsh white light I'd seen from outside, and I could hear what sounded like a woman humming, low and tuneless. I called out again, identifying myself, but the humming continued without pause. I checked each room methodically. A guest bedroom with dust on every surface, a bathroom with the medicine cabinet hanging open, and pill bottles scattered in the sink. A sewing room where every single thread had been pulled from the spools and tangled into a massive knot on the floor. The master bedroom door had been locked from the inside, one of those old push-button locks. But when I pressed my ear against it, I heard nothing. The humming from the lit room at the end never stopped, never varied in pitch or rhythm, like a recording stuck on loop. I reached the last room and pushed the door fully open with my foot, weapon raised. It was Margaret's husband's old study. She'd apparently kept it exactly as he'd left it. Medical journals stacked on the desk, a stethoscope draped over the chair. He'd been a doctor, from the looks of it. The humming came from an old cassette player on the bookshelf, the kind from the 80s with the silver buttons. But what made me radio for immediate backup was the wall behind the desk. Someone had written the same sentence over and over in what looked like black marker, covering every inch from floor to ceiling, the handwriting getting smaller and more frantic toward the edges. She's still on the phone. Hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and the marker was still there on the desk, cap off, tip still wet. I ejected the cassette and the humming stopped, revealing another sound I hadn't noticed before. Breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the room. I spun around, checking every corner, but I was alone. The breathing continued, and I realized with a sick feeling that it was coming from the heating vent in the floor. I got down on my knees and shined my flashlight through the grate, the metal cold against my face. Two eyes reflected back at me from about 3 feet down in the ductwork, wide and unblinking, and then they were gone, followed by the sound of someone crawling fast through the metal tubes, the banging and scraping echoing through the entire house. I jumped back and called it in. Possible suspect in the ventilation system, requesting immediate backup and possibly fire department to access the crawl space. The dispatcher confirmed units were 5 minutes out. Those eyes hadn't looked crazed or wild. They'd looked terrified, like whoever was down there was hiding from something else. I ran back downstairs to check the basement access, and that's when I saw the kitchen had changed. The plates on the dining table were now stacked in the sink, washed and drying in the rack. The pot roast was gone, the stove turned off, everything cleaned and put away like dinner had never happened. The phone was back on its cradle, and when I picked it up, the cord was intact, no sign it had ever been cut. My radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice asking for a status update, but before I could respond, I heard the front door open upstairs. I'd come down the back stairs that led directly to the kitchen. Footsteps crossed the living room, slow and measured, and then I heard a woman's voice, clear as day. "Yes, I'd like to report an intruder in my home. He's in my kitchen right now." My blood turned to ice because I recognized that voice from the original 911 call. It was Margaret Hobbs. I moved toward the living room, weapon drawn, announcing myself again. But when I rounded the corner, the room was empty. The TV was off, the lights were off, and through the window I could see my backup pulling into the driveway, their red and blue lights painting the walls. But on the coffee table, that same cup of tea sat steaming, and next to it was a note written in the same handwriting from upstairs. She never left the phone. We searched that house for 3 hours. 2 more units, a K-9 team, and even the fire department with their thermal imaging cameras. They found nobody in the vents. No trace anyone had been there except for some dust disturbance that could have been decades old. The basement had been locked from the outside with a padlock rusted shut for what looked like years. Margaret Hobbs wasn't there, wasn't at any neighbor's house, wasn't at the hospital or her daughter's place in Seattle. Her car was in the garage, keys on the hook by the door, purse on the counter with her wallet inside. The daughter drove down that night, confirmed her mother's reading glasses, confirmed that was her teacup, even confirmed the pot roast was her mother's usual Monday dinner. But she also told us something that made everyone exchange looks. Her mother had been having memory issues lately, confusion, sometimes thinking her dead husband was still alive, sometimes preparing dinner for him. We sealed the house as a potential crime scene, and I went home at 3 a.m. thinking maybe Margaret had wandered off. Maybe she'd had an episode and was confused somewhere in the neighborhood. 4 hours later, at 7:23 a.m., I was in my kitchen making coffee when my cell rang. It was dispatch, and the exhaustion in her voice was replaced with something else. Disbelief, maybe fear. Another 911 call had just come in from Margaret Hobbs's house. Same woman's voice, same whispered report of an intruder. The house had been sealed with crime scene tape, an officer posted outside all night who swore nobody had gone in or out. But the call was definitely coming from inside the house. They could trace it to the landline. I drove back there, met up with the same sergeant from the night before, and we entered together. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. Tape undisturbed, evidence markers still in place. Except the phone was off the hook again, receiver hanging just like before. And when we checked the 911 recording, you could hear Margaret's voice clear as day. But also something else in the background. My own voice from hours earlier, echoing like it was playing back, saying, "Margaret Hobbs, police, I'm coming inside to check on your welfare." The call lasted exactly 40 seconds, just like the first one, then cut to dead air. We never found Margaret Hobbs. Her daughter had her declared legally missing after 6 months, then legally dead after 2 years. The house stood empty for a while before the daughter finally sold it to a young couple from California who got it for way under market value. I kept tabs on the place, drove by sometimes on my patrol route. The new owners lasted 8 months before moving out, said they kept getting phone calls in the middle of the night, with nobody on the other end, just the sound of a TV playing in the background. The next family made it 4 months. The house has been for sale for 3 years now, and the realtor told me off the record that potential buyers always ask about the phone that keeps ringing during showings, even though the service was disconnected years ago. The police department officially closed the case as a missing person, probable dementia-related disappearance. But those of us who were there that night know something else happened in that house. I'm at a different precinct now, moved to day shifts downtown where the calls are about real things: robberies, accidents, domestic disputes. But sometimes, when I'm writing up a report late at night and the station is quiet, our emergency line will ring and nobody will answer the dispatcher. They'll stay on the line for exactly 40 seconds before hanging up. The number always traces back to disconnected lines, old houses, places that shouldn't be able to make calls anymore. Last week, one traced back to Margaret Hobbs' old number. The dispatcher, a new kid who wasn't there that night, said he could hear someone whispering but couldn't make out the words, just that it sounded like an old woman asking for help. I told him it was probably a glitch in the system. Old numbers sometimes ghost through the network. But I know Margaret is still trying to finish that first call, still trying to tell us something about who was in her house that night. Or maybe she's trying to warn us that whoever was there never actually left. I was 23 and fresh out of the academy when I got assigned to work under Detective Emily Harris in 2012. People called her the bulldog behind her back, not because she was mean, but because once she got her teeth into a case, she never let go. I'd been shadowing her for about 3 months, mostly petty theft and domestic disputes, nothing that really tested either of us. That changed on a humid Saturday morning in early July, when we got called to an apartment complex on the north side of town. The building was one of those converted warehouses from the 1940s, all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of place young professionals loved because it had character. We'd been told it was a possible suicide, but Emily had this way of narrowing her eyes when dispatch gave us information, like she could smell when something wasn't quite right through the radio waves. The apartment belonged to a guy named Kevin Brewster, 28 years old. Worked as a graphic designer for some startup downtown. The super had found him after Kevin's boss called asking why he hadn't shown up for 3 days straight. When we got there, the hallway was already crowded with uniforms and the medical examiner's team. The smell hit me first, that sweet, cloying stench that sticks to the inside of your nostrils for days. Emily didn't even flinch, just pulled on her gloves and ducked under the yellow tape. Kevin's door had one of those expensive electronic locks, the kind you program with codes instead of keys. The super swore up and down that it had been locked from the inside when he arrived, had to use his master override to get in. Inside, Kevin was sprawled on his living room floor, still wearing his work clothes from what looked like several days ago. Khakis and a button-down shirt with some tech company's logo on the pocket. The medical examiner, Dr. Patel, was already crouched beside the body when we walked in. He had this habit of humming classical music while he worked, something that always made crime scenes feel even more surreal. There were no obvious wounds that I could see, no blood pooling, no bruising around the neck, nothing that screamed violence. Kevin just looked like he'd decided to take a nap on his hardwood floor and never woke up. But Emily was already moving through the apartment like a bloodhound, examining every surface, every corner. She stopped at the kitchen counter where a half-eaten Chinese takeout container sat next to an empty beer bottle. The food had long since started growing mold, these fuzzy white and green patches that made my stomach turn. She took photos of everything, the angle of Kevin's body, the position of his hands, even the way his shirt was untucked on just one side. That's when Mrs. Kowalczyk from next door showed up in the hallway, practically vibrating with the need to tell someone what she knew. She was probably 70, wearing a housecoat covered in cartoon cats and slippers that had seen better decades. She grabbed Emily's arm the second we stepped out to talk to her, her fingers surprisingly strong for someone her age. "I heard them fighting," she said, her Polish accent thick with excitement and fear. 3 nights ago, maybe around 11, Kevin and someone else yelling so loud I could hear it through these old walls. She insisted it was definitely 2 distinct voices, male voices, and that she'd heard Kevin's door slam around midnight. Then she heard footsteps going down the hall toward the stairs, heavy ones, like someone wearing boots. But here's what made Emily's expression change. Mrs. Kowalczyk swore she never heard Kevin's door open or close again after that night. And she would know because her apartment was right next to his, and she barely slept anymore since her husband died. Emily spent the next hour interviewing everyone on that floor, while I went through Kevin's apartment more carefully. His laptop was still open on his desk, stuck on the login screen, battery long dead. There were design projects scattered across his workspace. Logos, website mock-ups, business cards for various clients. One caught my eye because it was printed on expensive paper, some law firm called Brennan and Associates. I bagged it along with everything else that seemed relevant. The bathroom medicine cabinet was full of the usual stuff: ibuprofen, allergy medication, some prescription antidepressants dated from 6 months earlier. But what really stood out was what wasn't there. No signs of a struggle anywhere. No defensive wounds on Kevin's hands when I looked closer. The windows were all locked from the inside, and this was a 4th-floor apartment with no fire escape. The only way in or out was through that front door with the electronic lock. The building's security setup was a joke. Just one camera in the lobby that the super admitted had been broken for 2 weeks before Kevin died. But Emily wasn't giving up that easy. She got the records from the electronic lock company, and this is where things got really strange. The lock's memory showed Kevin's code being entered at 7:43 p.m. 3 nights ago, then nothing until the super's override code at 10:15 a.m. when they found him. No other codes, no forced entry attempts, nothing. The lock company tech, this nervous kid named Bradley who kept pushing his glasses up his nose, explained that these locks were supposedly tamper-proof. If someone tried to hack it or use a keycard reader, it would log the attempt. But the log was clean. Emily had him check 3 times, even had his supervisor come down and verify. According to that lock, nobody went in or out of Kevin's apartment after 7:43 p.m., which lined up with when Kevin probably got home from work. The autopsy results came back 2 days later, and Dr. Patel looked genuinely puzzled when he called Emily. Cause of death was cardiac arrest, but Kevin was a healthy 28-year-old with no history of heart problems. The toxicology report showed something else, though. Traces of a synthetic compound that Patel couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't any standard drug or poison in their database. He sent samples to a specialized lab in Chicago, told us it would take at least a week to get results. Meanwhile, Emily had me digging into Kevin's life like we were archaeologists. His bank records showed regular deposits from his freelance work, nothing unusual there. But there was a cash withdrawal of $8,000 made 2 weeks before his death. When we asked his friends about it, nobody knew what it was for. His best friend Jamie said Kevin had been acting paranoid lately, always looking around when they went out, sometimes canceling plans at the last minute. We tracked down Kevin's ex-girlfriend, Natalie, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She hadn't seen him in months but mentioned something that made Emily sit up straighter. About 6 months ago, right before they broke up, Kevin had gotten involved with some guys who claimed they could help him expand his design business, get him contracts with bigger companies. She never met them, but Kevin would sometimes leave for meetings late at night, always came back tense and quiet. One time she saw a text on his phone from someone saved as just M that said, "You better deliver or we'll handle this differently." When she confronted Kevin about it, they had a huge fight and broke up shortly after. She tried calling him a few times after that, worried about him, but he never returned her calls. The last time she tried was about a month before he died, and his voicemail box was full. The lab in Chicago finally identified the compound. It was a derivative of succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in hospitals during surgery. But this version had been modified somehow, made to break down faster in the body, harder to detect. Dr. Patel explained that if someone had been injected with it, they would have been completely paralyzed but fully conscious for maybe 10 to 15 minutes before their respiratory system shut down. The thought of Kevin lying there, unable to move or call for help, aware of everything happening to him, made me physically sick. But here's the problem. There were no injection marks on his body. Patel checked everywhere, even between his toes and under his hairline. The only way the drug could have entered his system was orally, probably mixed with something he ate or drank. Emily immediately thought of the Chinese food and beer, but the restaurant checked out clean, and the beer bottle was a brand Kevin bought regularly from the corner store. Then we caught a break, or at least we thought we did. A guy named Vincent Russo got picked up for assault in a bar fight, and when they ran his prints, he had a connection to Kevin. They'd gone to community college together years ago. Under questioning, Vincent admitted he'd been hired to send a message to Kevin about some money he owed. He said he went to Kevin's apartment that night with another guy, Tommy Garza, just to scare him. According to Vincent, they argued with Kevin about payment for some services Kevin had agreed to provide, creating fake IDs and documents using his design skills. Kevin had taken the $8,000 as a down payment, but then got cold feet, tried to back out. Vincent swore they just yelled at him, maybe pushed him around a little, but left him very much alive. He said Tommy might have slipped something in Kevin's beer when he wasn't looking, just to mess with him, but nothing that should have killed him. But here's where everything fell apart. Tommy Garza had an alibi. He was in lockup in Indiana that night for a DUI. Didn't get released until 2 days after Kevin died. Vincent's story changed 3 times in the next hour, each version different from the last. First he said they left at midnight, then 11:30. Then he wasn't sure if he'd even gone to Kevin's apartment at all. His lawyer showed up and shut down the interrogation, and without physical evidence placing Vincent at the scene, we had to let him go. No fingerprints except Kevin's in the apartment. The DNA from the beer bottle and takeout containers all came back as Kevin's. Even the hallway cameras from the building next door, which had a partial view of Kevin's building entrance, showed nobody entering or leaving during the time frame Mrs. Kowalczyk described. Emily went through that footage frame by frame, hours of it, until her eyes were bloodshot. She kept muttering about how someone had to have been there. The neighbor heard them, but the evidence just wasn't there. The case went cold after 6 months. Emily never stopped working it, even after I got transferred to another precinct. She'd call me sometimes with new theories. Maybe someone had climbed between balconies. Maybe there was a second electronic code that got erased somehow. Maybe the lock company was involved, but nothing ever panned out. Vincent Russo died in a motorcycle accident 2 years later, took whatever he really knew with him. Tommy Garza disappeared completely. Some said he fled to Mexico. The building eventually changed the locks to regular deadbolts after 2 more residents complained about glitches with the electronic system. Mrs. Kowalczyk passed away in 2016, still insisting she knew what she heard that night. Emily retired in 2018, and at her retirement party, after a few drinks, she told me that the Kevin Brewster case was the one that would haunt her forever. Not because of what we found, but because of what we couldn't explain. How does someone get into a locked apartment, poison a man, and vanish without leaving a single trace? To this day, whenever I pass by that converted warehouse building, I still wonder what really happened in apartment 4B that July night in 2012. "12 years on the force, and I thought I'd seen everything our small Pennsylvania town could throw at me. Cold cases became my specialty about 2 years ago, which meant spending most of my days in the basement evidence room, surrounded by boxes of forgotten crimes. My wife Susan used to joke that I was becoming part of the furniture down there, and honestly, she wasn't far off. I'd gotten comfortable with the routine: pull a file, review witness statements, make some calls, update the digital records, repeat. Most detectives avoided the evidence room like the plague because of how depressing it felt. All those unsolved cases just sitting there collecting dust. But I actually found it peaceful. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, the air smelled like old paper and mildew, and the only sounds were usually my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. That all changed on a Monday morning in November 2017, when I discovered someone had been tampering with my cases. I'd gone down to retrieve the Garrett homicide files from 1989, a case I'd been reviewing for the past month. The box should have been exactly where I left it on shelf B14, 3rd row from the bottom, case number clearly marked on the side in black marker. Instead, I found it sitting on the floor beside the shelf with its lid crooked and the contents obviously disturbed. My first thought was that maybe Stan, our evidence clerk who'd worked there since the 90s, had needed to move things around for some reason. But Stan was meticulous about logging any changes, and he would have emailed me if he'd touched my active cases. The security system showed the real problem. According to the keycard logs, nobody had entered the evidence room since I'd left on Friday afternoon. Only 6 people had access: myself, 2 other cold case detectives named Ford and Castellano, Stan, Captain Rogers, and Deputy Chief Hawthorne. Yet here was undeniable proof that someone had been here, going through these specific files. The Garrett case wasn't random either. It involved the murder of a 19-year-old college student found beaten to death behind a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The original investigation had stalled after 3 months with no solid leads, no witnesses, and forensic technology that couldn't do much with the limited evidence collected. What made me suspicious was how specific the tampering was. The crime scene photos were shuffled out of order, witness statements had been rearranged, but most concerning was that the original investigating officer's handwritten notes were completely missing. Those notes, written by Detective Roy Brennan, who'd retired 8 years ago, contained details that never made it into the official typed reports. I'd read them just 2 weeks earlier, and they'd mentioned several persons of interest who were never formally interviewed, including the son of a prominent local businessman who'd had connections to several city officials at the time. I decided to check the other cold cases I'd been working on, and that's when my chest started to tighten with genuine fear. 3 more boxes showed signs of tampering: the Melissa Howard disappearance from 1992, the John Doe found in the river in 1987, and the Blackwood family double homicide from 1995. Each box had been carefully searched, with specific documents either missing or rearranged. The pattern became clear quickly. Someone was specifically targeting cases from the late 80s and early 90s, all unsolved murders or disappearances, and they were removing or disturbing documents that referenced certain investigating officers or witness statements. My mind raced as I stood there in that cold basement, surrounded by decades of tragedy and secrets. Whoever was doing this had intimate knowledge of these cases and knew exactly what they were looking for. They also had to have a way into this room that bypassed our security system, which should have been impossible. I spent the rest of that Monday documenting everything with my phone camera, taking pictures of every disturbed box, every out-of-place file. I didn't report it immediately because something told me to be careful, to gather more information first. That instinct probably saved my career, maybe even my life. Instead of going through official channels, I went to the local electronics store during my lunch break and bought 3 small wireless cameras, the kind people use for home security. They were tiny, about the size of a button, with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. I returned to the evidence room that evening after most people had left, claiming I needed to work late on a case. Installing the cameras took less than 20 minutes. One pointed at the main entrance, another covering the shelves where the tampered boxes were stored, and the third overlooking the far corner where old surveillance equipment and evidence computers were kept. The cameras would send alerts and video directly to my personal phone, completely bypassing the department's systems. For 3 days, nothing happened. I checked the feeds obsessively, watching hours of empty footage showing nothing but shadows and stillness. I started to wonder if maybe I was being paranoid, if there was some logical explanation I'd missed. Then, on Friday morning at 3:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I grabbed it from my nightstand, careful not to wake Susan, and opened the camera app with trembling fingers. The infrared image was grainy, but clear enough to see a figure moving through the evidence room. They were wearing dark clothing and had something covering their face, maybe a ski mask or balaclava. But what made my mouth go dry was how they moved, with complete confidence, going straight to specific shelves without hesitation, like they'd done this dozens of times before. They pulled out the Blackwood family homicide box and began methodically going through it, using a small flashlight to read documents before photographing certain pages with what looked like a phone. I sat up in bed, recording everything on my phone while watching this person work. They spent exactly 12 minutes in the room, and during that time, they removed several documents from the Blackwood box and placed them in a black folder they'd brought with them. Then something happened that made me nearly drop my phone. The figure walked over to the old evidence computer in the corner and logged in without hesitation. They knew the password. They navigated through the system for about 5 minutes, and I could see the screen's glow reflecting off their mask as they worked. Whatever they were doing, they'd clearly done it before. The way their fingers moved across the keyboard showed familiarity with our internal systems that only someone from inside the department would have. When they finished, they carefully returned the box to its shelf, adjusted it to look undisturbed, and walked toward the exit. Just before leaving, they did something that sent ice through my veins. They looked directly at one of my cameras, stared at it for maybe 2 seconds, then continued out the door as if they hadn't seen anything. The next morning, I arrived at the station earlier than usual, around 6 a.m. I needed to check that evidence computer before anyone else got there. The login history had been wiped clean, but I knew enough about our system to check the deeper logs that most people didn't know existed. What I found made me sick to my stomach. Someone had been accessing the database regularly for the past 18 months, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always when the building was supposed to be empty. They'd been systematically viewing and altering records for dozens of cold cases, all from that same era. But here's what really got me. The alterations were subtle, just small changes to witness statements, minor adjustments to timelines, names spelled slightly differently. Nothing that would trigger an alert, but enough to make these cases practically impossible to solve if anyone ever tried to revisit them. I cross-referenced the altered cases with department records from the original investigations, and that's when I noticed the pattern that changed everything. Every single altered case had originally been investigated by a group of 4 detectives who all worked together in the late 80s and early 90s. Roy Brennan, who'd retired, Paul Garrison, died of a heart attack in 2010, Deputy Chief Hawthorne, still active, and Captain Rogers, also still active. These 4 had been partners and friends, often working cases together or covering for each other. The more I dug, the more disturbing details emerged. Several witnesses from those old cases had complained about intimidation, evidence that disappeared, and leads that were never followed. But all those complaints had been buried in administrative files, deemed unsubstantiated by internal reviews conducted by, guess who, Hawthorne and Rogers themselves. I found a particularly damning report from 1993, where a witness named Jennifer Moss had claimed that Detective Garrison threatened her family if she testified about seeing a certain person at the Blackwood crime scene. That person was the nephew of a major construction company owner who'd won several city contracts around that time. The witness retracted her statement 2 days later, and the case went cold. I knew I needed more evidence before I could take this to anyone, especially since 2 of the suspected officers were my direct superiors. I spent the weekend at home, pretending everything was normal while secretly copying all my findings onto multiple flash drives. Susan noticed I was distracted, kept asking if everything was okay at work, and I had to lie to her for the first time in our marriage. That hurt almost as much as discovering the corruption. On Monday, I went back to reviewing my camera footage from Friday night, this time focusing on details I might have missed. That's when I noticed something crucial. The intruder had a slight limp in their left leg, a distinctive way of favoring their right side when walking. I'd seen that exact gait before. Deputy Chief Hawthorne had the same limp from an old injury he'd gotten during a pursuit in 2003, a story he loved to tell at department gatherings. The build was right too. Tall, broad shoulders, the way he carried himself even when trying to disguise it. I couldn't go to Captain Rogers. He was likely involved. I couldn't go to Hawthorne for obvious reasons. The only option was to go outside the department, but I needed absolutely bulletproof evidence first. I set up more cameras, this time hidden throughout the evidence room in places nobody would think to look, inside old evidence boxes that hadn't been touched in decades, behind loose ceiling tiles, even inside a broken printer that had been sitting in the corner for years. Then I did something risky. I started leaving subtle traps. I'd place tiny pieces of transparent tape on certain boxes in specific patterns that would break if someone opened them. I photographed every single placement. I also started making loud comments around the station about how close I was to breaking the Garrett case, how I'd found new leads that could blow everything wide open. It was all lies, but I needed to force their hand, make them sloppy. Hawthorne's reaction was telling. He suddenly became very interested in my work, stopping by my desk multiple times a day to check on my progress, with a smile that never reached his eyes. The confrontation came 2 days later, but not how I expected. I was working late, legitimately this time, when Hawthorne walked into my office around 9 p.m. He closed the door behind him and sat down across from me, perfectly calm. "You've been busy lately," he said, his voice steady and almost friendly. "Those cameras you installed are impressive, very thorough." My heart hammered, but I kept my face neutral, asking what he meant. He leaned back and laughed, actually laughed, before telling me I had 2 choices. Option 1, I could take early retirement with full benefits, a glowing recommendation and a nice bonus for my years of dedicated service. Option 2, things could get complicated. He didn't elaborate on what complicated meant, but he mentioned how unfortunate it would be if certain evidence appeared linking me to mishandled cases, how my reputation could be destroyed, how these things could affect my family. He gave me 48 hours to decide, then walked out like we'd just discussed the weather. That night I made copies of everything and drove 3 hours to the FBI field office in Philadelphia, where I handed over 18 months of evidence to agents who'd been investigating similar patterns in 3 other counties. The arrests happened 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. FBI agents swept through our department and 3 others simultaneously, arresting Hawthorne, Rogers, and 14 other current and former officers across the region. The investigation revealed a 30-year conspiracy involving bribes from local crime families, evidence tampering, and at least 11 murders that had been deliberately covered up. Some victims were people who'd threatened to expose the corruption. Others were just inconvenient witnesses to crimes committed by people with the right connections. Roy Brennan, the retired detective, cut a deal and testified against everyone in exchange for reduced charges. He revealed how they'd been taking money since 1987, how they'd pick which cases to bury, how they'd threaten or pay off witnesses. The Garrett case that started my investigation? Turns out the kid had been killed by the son of that businessman I'd read about, and the whole thing had been covered up for a $50,000 payment split 4 ways. I testified for 3 days straight, showing my videos, my evidence, everything I'd gathered. Hawthorne got 35 years, Rogers got 28, and the others got various sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. The FBI offered me a job, but I turned it down. I stayed in town, took over as head of a newly formed cold case unit with federal oversight, and we've solved 17 cases in the past 3 years using evidence that had been deliberately hidden. Susan says I sleep better now, and she's right. Sometimes I still go down to that evidence room, now completely reorganized and under new management, and I think about all those families who finally got answers. The room doesn't feel haunted anymore. It feels like a place where truth finally won. My name's Sarah Bennett, and at that point in my career I'd been working late shifts more often than I'd like to admit. Most nights were quiet, filled with paperwork and the occasional noise complaint, but that particular night, my phone buzzed with a call that immediately pulled me out of routine. A family reported seeing a masked man standing in their hallway. The father's voice on the line carried this strange mix of urgency and confusion, like he couldn't decide if what he'd witnessed had really happened. I drove over thinking it would be another case of shadows or nerves. What I walked into was nothing I could file away under overreaction. The house was a 2-story colonial, clean and orderly in a way that told me the family wasn't the type to dramatize. Inside, the air felt heavy with that kind of silence people force on themselves when they're terrified of being heard. The mother, Claire, was clutching her son's arm so tightly he had faint red marks where her fingers dug in. The boy couldn't have been older than 10, but his wide eyes looked years ahead of him in fear. The father, Mark, kept pacing from the front door to the staircase, repeating the same line. I saw him. He was right there. His certainty wasn't shaken, not even by the locked windows and doors I'd already checked myself. I walked them through the house, asking them to show me where exactly the figure had stood. The hallway light was still on, casting a pale yellow glow on the polished wooden floor. Mark pointed to the end of the hall, right outside the bedrooms. He said the man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in a black mask until Mark shouted. And then somehow, he was gone. What unsettled me wasn't the story itself, but the detail that all the locks were intact. No sign of forced entry, no open windows, no damage anywhere. It didn't add up, and the family's collective unease made it hard to dismiss as imagination. The turning point of the walkthrough came in the master bedroom. I noticed something the family hadn't mentioned, a dining chair wedged neatly under the inside doorknob. It was positioned in such a deliberate way that it could only mean someone tried to barricade the door from inside. Claire gasped when she saw it and swore they hadn't put it there. Mark backed her up instantly, his voice almost cracking. Their son started crying again, saying he wanted to leave the house. I leaned closer to inspect the chair and immediately knew I had to call in for fingerprint analysis. That's when the night began to feel less like a domestic call and more like I had stepped into someone else's game. The crime scene unit arrived quickly, and while they dusted for prints, I sat with the family in their living room. The house suddenly felt smaller, as if every shadow had its own secret. Claire tried to busy herself by straightening magazines on the coffee table, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Mark kept pulling back the curtains and checking outside, though he knew the locks hadn't been tampered with. Their son sat wrapped in a blanket, refusing to speak anymore. I've been around panic before, but this wasn't just fear. It was the confusion of people who no longer trusted the safety of their own walls. When the fingerprint tech approached me, he didn't say much, just raised his eyebrows in a way that signaled trouble. The prints on the chair didn't match any member of the family. Not partial, not smudged, but clean, deliberate impressions, as if whoever did it wanted us to know they were there. The realization weighed on me. If someone had really been inside, how did they get out without triggering a single lock or leaving a trace? I didn't share that detail with the family right away. They were shaken enough. Instead, I excused myself and walked the perimeter again, searching for something I might have overlooked. Outside, the night air was crisp, and the backyard stretched into a line of tall trees swaying under the dim streetlight glow. I scanned the ground carefully, expecting footprints in the soil, but there was nothing, not even a scuff. The grass looked untouched. The only thing that stood out was a faint impression on the side of the porch railing, as though someone had leaned there briefly. It wasn't enough to prove entry or exit, but paired with that barricaded bedroom door, it made the whole scene feel intentional, staged almost. Whoever this masked figure was, he wanted them unsettled. Back inside, I decided to ask the boy again, gently this time, away from his parents. Kids see details adults miss even when fear clouds their memory. He whispered that the man hadn't just stood there. He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening. The detail chilled me more than anything else that night. I walked him back to his parents, replaying his words in my head. A stranger silently listening inside their home, with no forced entry, no broken locks, and foreign fingerprints on a chair. The deeper I dug, the less it resembled a standard break-in. Hours slipped by while we combed through every inch of the house. Nothing new surfaced and fatigue set in. Claire begged me to stay a little longer, so I kept my notebook open, circling the same details, hoping fresh eyes would catch something. Then, almost as if on cue, the fingerprint results came back. No matches in any database. Whoever had been in that bedroom wasn't some random burglar already on record. That realization turned the whole night from a security breach into something stranger. Someone methodical, precise, and entirely untraceable had walked through their hallway. Before leaving, I asked Mark to demonstrate again what he saw. We stood in the same hallway, the yellow bulb flickering above us. He described the stillness of the masked figure, the silence, the way he thought it was a prank until the man vanished. His words didn't waver, and I could almost picture it myself. As he spoke, I noticed the chair had been removed from the bedroom and set back against the wall, exactly where it belonged at the dining table. None of us had moved it. I didn't announce it aloud, but the hair on my arms rose all the same. I finally convinced them to spend the night at a relative's house while we secured the property. As they packed quickly, I stayed near the doorway, scanning every surface one more time. The house gave nothing away, but it didn't feel empty either. It felt watched. Before leaving, I locked the door myself, tested it twice, and drove behind the family's car until they reached the highway. My cruiser's headlights stretched over their rear bumper, and I kept replaying the boy's words, how the man had tilted his head, like he was listening. Listening for what? Listening to whom? The report I filed that morning was clinical, stripped of the unease that clung to me. I wrote down the facts. Unidentified prints, no forced entry, objects moved without explanation. But the truth I carried was heavier. Someone had been inside that home with an ease I couldn't explain, and they left behind just enough evidence to make sure we knew it. To this day, the family never returned to live there full time, and I can't blame them. Whenever I think of that night, it isn't the mask that unsettles me most. It's the silence of that barricaded bedroom, a silence that didn't belong to the house at all. When I think back on my time wearing the badge, there's one night that has stuck with me in a way no other call ever has. My name's Dana Collins, and during that period I was assigned to routine patrols in a small, quiet stretch of highway that rarely made headlines. I wasn't chasing high-profile cases or working big city beats. Most of my nights involved checking on noise complaints, the occasional DUI, or writing up reports for property disputes. That's why I remember the call about the old roadside motel so clearly. At first glance, it seemed like another dull nuisance, just a group of kids breaking in where they shouldn't. The place had been closed down for years. The sign faded, half the letters broken, with weeds climbing high enough to choke the parking lot. The building itself sat low against the road, paint peeling in wide strips that looked like skin sunburned and left to flake. Folks in town used to whisper that the place had been cursed. After a string of sudden closures, a fire, and a few unexplained accidents, no owner ever held onto it for long. By the time I started responding to calls there, it was more of an eyesore than a landmark, the kind of property people avoided without really knowing why. That night I was dispatched after another report of trespassers. The caller claimed they had seen lights moving inside the boarded windows, though there was no power running to the building. It was already past midnight when I pulled into the gravel lot. My headlights swept across the cracked asphalt, catching a cluster of broken beer bottles and spray paint cans near the steps. I figured it would be the usual group of teens daring each other to stay inside until I showed up. Still, the air around the motel carried a strange heaviness, like the silence wasn't natural but deliberate. Walking inside required a firm push. The front door had swollen from water damage and groaned when it gave way. The lobby was stripped bare, only a desk and a few toppled chairs left. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, revealing graffiti on nearly every wall. I announced myself the way we're trained to. Loud, firm, letting any trespassers know law enforcement was present. No answer. I checked room after room, each one in worse shape than the last. Mattresses slashed open, doors hanging loose, floorboards warped with mold. Then, in the far hallway, I noticed something odd. The proportions of one room didn't match the rest. The space inside seemed smaller than what the building's layout should have allowed. I walked back into the hallway and studied the walls more carefully. On one side, the wallpaper was peeling at a sharp vertical seam that didn't line up with the studs. I pressed against it with my hand, and it gave slightly, almost like a hollow panel. My pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the sense that I had stumbled into something beyond routine trespassing. After a few shoves, the false wall creaked open, revealing a narrow gap. The air that escaped from it smelled different, a sour, stale odor that had been trapped inside far too long. The passage led to a hidden corridor, narrower than the motel's actual hallways, lined with plywood doors. Each one had a peephole cut into it from the inside, not the outside. When I crouched to shine my light through one of them, the beam landed on a small room no bigger than a closet, furnished with nothing but a rusted cot and chains bolted to the wall. A camera mount still screwed into the corner faced directly at the bed. The silence in that space pressed down on me harder than any noise could have. Whoever had built this hadn't done it for pranks or storage. It was deliberate, calculated. I forced myself to check the other doors. Every hidden room was the same. A place to confine someone, record them, and leave no trace. In some of them, the cameras were still hanging, their wires running through holes that led to the walls of the adjacent motel rooms. From those guest rooms, someone could sit comfortably, watch everything live, and no one outside would ever suspect. I had handled crime scenes before, but nothing in my training prepared me for the sheer scale of what I was looking at. Each detail screamed of planning, patience, and cruelty. By the time I reached the end of the hidden corridor, I found what looked like an office cobbled together from plywood and scavenged furniture. Stacks of ledgers sat on the desk, some of them water-damaged but still legible. Inside were names, dates, and even descriptions. Some entries were marked with red X's, others with notes that didn't make sense until I thought about them in the context of missing persons cases I'd read over the years. It was like standing inside a ledger of the disappeared. At that moment, the trespassing calls made more sense. Someone had been returning to this place, maybe to recover what was left behind. I radioed for backup, my voice steadier than I expected, though inside I felt like the floor had shifted under me. Dispatch confirmed units were en route, but it would take time to reach such an isolated stretch of road. While waiting, I kept moving through the office. There were VHS tapes stacked in milk crates, each labeled with nothing more than a number and a date. The thought of what might be on them turned my mouth dry, but I couldn't bring myself to play one. The silence of the motel felt amplified, as if the walls were holding their breath with me. When backup arrived, I wasn't the only one unsettled. The other officers wore the same expression I did, like they had stumbled into a story that no one would believe without proof. Crime scene investigators worked the place for weeks, cataloging everything: the hidden architecture, the recording equipment, the ledgers, the tapes. Cross-referenced with missing persons reports from nearby states, the evidence painted a horrifying picture. Dozens of names matched. People who had vanished on road trips, business travel, even locals who had simply walked out one day and never came back. They had all been funneled through this forgotten roadside motel. The case drew state and federal attention fast. Forensic teams uncovered fingerprints, DNA traces, and signs that the motel had been in operation far longer than anyone imagined. Whoever ran it had vanished without a trace, leaving only the architecture of cruelty behind. I was interviewed countless times, asked to retrace every step of the night I found the hidden corridor. The weight of it sat with me differently than any other case. It wasn't just evidence on paper. It was the memory of that first hidden door giving way under my hand, revealing a world no one should have been able to conceal. Eventually, the motel was condemned and sealed off. Some wanted to tear it down, but preservation orders kept it standing as evidence in ongoing investigations. Even now, years later, I can't drive past that stretch of highway without feeling the pull of it. The trespassing calls stopped, almost like the discovery had silenced whatever lingered there. I don't know if the people responsible were ever caught or if they simply moved on to another location. What I do know is this: behind those false walls were the lives of countless missing people, and I'll never forget the moment I realized I was standing in the middle of their graveyard.